Hi, I'm the Octopus Lady. You're watching Alien Ocean, and let's talk about humpback whales today, shall we? Now, I'm sure some of you who've been watching my videos for a while are like, humpback whales? Octopus Lady, I thought you said sperm whales were the only marine mammals you were ever going to make a video about because you don't like marine mammals. Which, one, I did in fact say that, but I guess I was lying. Although I didn't know at the time that I was lying, so I guess I wasn't lying. And two, I need to set the record straight. I don't dislike all marine mammals. Just some marine mammals, specifically seals, sea lions, sea otters, dolphins, and orcas. And if you want to know why, I already ranted about it in my sperm whale video, so you can go watch that. But again, there are some marine mammals that I don't dislike, like walruses. I appreciate walruses, and I think it would be really lovely to have tea with manatees and dugongs. I bet tea time with them is just delightful. And then finally, whales. I like whales. They're some of the good ones. I have friends who are whales, like Eman. Well, Eman isn't a whale herself, but she does study them, humpback whales in specific, and she talks about them a bunch over on TikTok, which is where I discovered her. And after watching some of her videos, I found out that humpback whales are way more interesting than I previously thought. Eman was kind enough to take time out of her busy schedule of getting an entire PhD to collab with me on this video, which was really awesome of her, so be sure to go follow her over on TikTok and Instagram. Her handle for both platforms are @Whale Detective. She'll be showing up later in the video, but for now, let's get the usual stuff out of the way first. Humpback whales are in the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Chordata, and they are 100% mammal. They're within the order of Cetariodactyla, which means all whales are related to animals like giraffes, cows, camels, and deer. Seriously, we're pretty sure that a long time ago there was some land-dwelling cow-like creature that wandered into the ocean one day, and after thousands of years, its descendants evolved into members of the infraorder of Cetacea, which are the toothed whales and the baleen whales. So yeah, these guys and these guys are like cousins, I guess. Evolution is weird. Humpback whales are within the family Balænopteridae, which are the whales with balines. And Eman is going to be talking more about what balines are and how they work later in the video. And FYI, whales who are part of this family are also sometimes colloquially called rorquals. 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 I think that's it. And then finally, humpback whales are within the genus and species Megaptera novae angliae, and they are the only members of this genus. Moving on to their fossil history, the oldest fossils of humpback whales we found date to about 100,000 to 800,000 years ago, which, when I read that, blew my mind, because I'm so used to everything in the ocean being tens of millions of years old at a minimum. However, we did find fossils of a barnacle species that are almost always found on humpback whales, and they date back to about 2.6 to 3.6 million years ago. So humpback whales probably existed around that time too, and that, my brain accepts that number a little more easily. But it still makes humpback whales the youngest organisms I've ever talked about on my channel, beating out the previous baby of the Alien Ocean family, seahorses, by almost 10 million years. Also, I don't really know what to put for a photo here, because the fossils that put humpback whales at around 2.6 to 3.6 million years old are of barnacles, and I can't put barnacle fossils where the humpback whale fossils are supposed to be. And these are photos of actual humpback whale fossils, but these are the ones that are from 100,000 to 800,000 years ago. I guess what I'll do is use a cropped photo of the whale fossils, but show the barnacle date and then add some asterisks and a note at the bottom. Y'all, I'm seriously considering getting rid of my fossil timeline thing. It's becoming so illegible, I have to keep making it smaller and smaller just to fit everything on screen. I started this timeline thing to help give context to what all these big numbers mean, but I don't think this is giving context to anything. I don't know, what do y'all think? Should I keep it or should I toss it? Leave a comment with your thoughts on this paleontological mess. Finally, humpback whales are found in every ocean in the entire world, but not all the time. It mostly depends on the season. Typically, through spring, summer, and autumn, they're found in temperate to polar waters, and then they winter in tropical waters. This is the first time I've ever heard winter used as a verb, and I quite enjoy it. It makes humpback whales sound like they're a fancy British family. Yes, we'll be wintering in the tropics this year, Reginald. This means, though, that humpback whales are a highly migratory species, and it was believed for a long time that they exclusively stayed in their respective hemispheres. In other words, southern hemisphere whales would only migrate within the southern hemisphere, and ditto to the northern hemisphere whales. But then, some researchers took photos of humpback whales near Antarctica, and then later that year, some other researchers took photos of humpback whales near Costa Rica and found out that 3 of the whales that were seen in the southern hemisphere were now chilling in the northern hemisphere. And according to the latter group of researchers, the minimum distance between these 2 locations was about 8,300 kilometers. To my fellow Americans, that's about 5,000 miles. You'd have to drive all the way from Anchorage, Alaska to Miami, Florida to cover the same distance. If you're in Africa, you'd have to drive from Khartoum, Sudan to Cape Town, South Africa. South Americans, y'all would have to drive from Bogota, Colombia to Montevideo, Uruguay. Asians, you're road tripping from Colombo, Sri Lanka to Shenzhen, China. Australians, you'd have to drive from Perth to Brisbane and then immediately turn around and drive all the way back. And Europeans, y'all would be traveling from Berlin, Germany to Madrid, Spain to Bucharest, Romania to Minsk, Belarus, and then back to Berlin. God, your continent is tiny. And by the way, that 5,000 miles / 8,300 kilometers was one way for these whales. If they ended up swimming back to where they started in Antarctica, their round trip distance would be 10,000 miles / 16,600 kilometers. That's 42% of the circumference of the Earth, which is absurd. That's so far. This means that humpback whales might have the longest migratory patterns of any mammal. And what's funny is that we don't even really know why they migrate. And there's gotta be a reason, because what's especially weird is that humpback whales don't eat when they're in the tropics. There just isn't enough food for them there. They swim thousands and thousands of miles just to not eat anything for several months. Isn't that wild? Whale migration in general, regardless of species, is kind of a mystery. And there are a few hypotheses that attempt to explain why they migrate. And I say attempt because I felt like every time I read one paper that claimed whale migration was because of X reason, another paper would pop up and be like, actually, like, oh my God, there was this one paper I was trying to read. It had so much terminology in it that I didn't understand, and I spent like 4 hours trying to comprehend this thing. Basically, the hypothesis was that it actually takes whales less energy overall to swim to warm tropical waters and not eat for a while than it does to stay alive in polar waters that get extra cold in the winter. But then this paper was like, nah, that's not true. There was another hypothesis that supposedly claimed that whale migration was this old habit from when the oceans were smaller. Like, the ancestors of whales used to migrate because they didn't have to travel as far, and that was a behavior that got passed down through the generations or something. I don't know. I wasn't able to read about this hypothesis because it was in a book, not in a paper. And I spent way too long trying to find a digital copy of it online because my local libraries didn't carry it, and I didn't want to have to actually buy the thing. And all that ended up being a huge waste of time too, because it turns out that hypothesis has been debunked as well. Yet another hypothesis said that whales migrate to warmer tropical waters because it's easier for newborn calves to thermoregulate themselves, and okay, this one doesn't seem to be completely debunked, but it hasn't necessarily been proven either. And then finally, one of the last papers I read about this topic said that whales probably migrate to avoid being predated on by orcas. But then I found this paper that was like, Lamau, nope, and at that point I just gave up. So why do whales migrate? I don't know, and I don't think anyone else does either. The other big mystery around humpback whale migration is how they're able to travel so precisely. When humpback whales pick a direction they want to go in, they can just maintain it easily to within 1 degree of accuracy, which sounds simple, but like Think about this. Humpback whales cross massive ocean basins, which means that for long periods of time, they're basically surrounded only by empty blue water. There's no landmarks or points of reference to guide their direction. And anyone who has gone scuba diving out in the open ocean knows how disorienting it can be when you're surrounded by all that blue. Additionally, ocean currents don't seem to knock humpback whales off course, nor do random storms that come out of nowhere. And we have no idea how they do this. Other animals who migrate tend to either use the sun or the Earth's magnetic fields to guide them, but seemingly not humpbacks. Because, like, the angle of the sun relative to where you are is based on the time of day, and also where you're located latitudinally in the world. The sun is going to be in a different position in the sky at noon o'clock if you're at the equator versus if you're several thousands of miles north, right? But whales can travel in the same direction for hours on end, for days on end, which means that the angle of the sun is not only constantly changing relative to the whale as the day goes on, but it's also changing as the whale's latitude changes. And yet, humpback whales don't seem to adjust what they're doing to get a consistent orientation to the sun. They just keep cruising. Not to mention that whales that have been seen traveling in similar directions were at completely different sun angles, and whales traveling in different directions have been seen at very similar sun angles. Whales don't seem to be too bothered by the Earth's magnetic field either. They'll cross great distances where the position of the magnetic field will vary by up to 22 degrees, and they just stay in a nice straight line. Also, whales that have been seen hanging out in the same area will all leave it going in different directions. If they were using Earth's magnetic field to navigate, then, you know, they all would have followed Earth's magnetic field when they were peacing out. Now, it's important to remember that this information doesn't completely rule out humpbacks using the sun or magnetic fields as guidance. It just rules out the idea that they're using these methods exclusively. They still might be utilizing one of them, but in conjunction with other navigational techniques that we don't know about. So while we don't know why they migrate, or how, really, we know what humpback whales do once they reach their destinations. In cold polar waters, they eat a bunch, which Eman is going to talk more about in her section, and in warm tropical waters, they get some. Wintertime is the breeding season for humpback whales, but we don't seem to know a lot about their mating habits. We know the males definitely compete with each other for females. If a male is chilling with a female and another intruder male shows up, the first male will do things like swim into the path of the intruder or suck in water or air so their ventral pleats expand and make themselves look bigger. These are ventral pleats, by the way. They've also been seen blowing bubble curtains around females to try to disorient other males, and Eman will be talking more about bubble curtains in a little bit. But if none of those strategies successfully chase off an intruder, then males just get violent with each other, like real violent. They'll smack each other with their flukes, aka their tail fins, ram into each other head first, or hit each other with their caudal peduncle, which is this part of their tail. And that's so much worse than getting hit with a fluke, because a fluke hit is kind of like getting smacked, but a caudal peduncle hit is kind of like getting bludgeoned. Also, they might potentially use the barnacles that grow on their fins, heads, and tails as weapons to cut each other. Because if you've ever gone wandering around on rocks at low tide without shoes on, you know how much barnacles can tear your skin up if you aren't careful. We know the male humpbacks also sing to the females during the breeding season. And did you know that it's only the males who sing? I didn't know that until I started working on this video. Anyway, here's a little sample of a humpback whale serenading. The thing is, though, we don't entirely know why they sing. I mean, it's likely tied to attracting females, but it can be difficult to discern what giant animals are doing with each other when they're underwater where we can't really see them. What we have seen, though, is escorting, which is when a whale, regardless of its sex, kind of follows an adult female and her baby calf around. Males during the breeding season seem to spend most of their time in groups with mama whales and their babies, and they spend way more time singing while they're escorting, versus when they're around other groups of whales. So the males are clearly trying to woo the ladies, but any mating rituals or behaviors beyond that are still a mystery because we've never actually seen humpback whales have sex with each other. Well, actually, that's not true. A paper was released earlier this year that reported on the very first sighting ever of humpback whales copulating, but It was between two males. Which, one, get it, boys, and two, don't let anyone ever tell you that homosexuality is unnatural. Winter is also the calving season, or the season where pregnant females give birth, and get a load of this. Pregnancy in humpback whales lasts around 11 and a half months. Doesn't that sound awful? Could you imagine being pregnant for that long? There's also evidence that female whales can get pregnant right after they give birth. This might be why males seem really interested in cozying up to mother-calf pairs during the breeding season. And also, researchers have reported seeing female whales give birth to offspring over several consecutive years. I've said it once and I'll say it again. It really sucks sometimes to be the childbearing member of a species, doesn't it? Anyway, I've been talking long enough. Let's hear from someone who literally spends her days out on boats directly studying these enormous creatures. Everyone, please give a warm alien ocean welcome to Eman the Whale Detective.
Hi, I'm Eman. I am a humpback whale researcher. The Octopus Lady covered so much information about humpback whales, but there's so much more we know about them, so let's dive right in. Humpback whales, when fully grown, can be about 55 feet in length, and they can weigh up to 80,000 pounds. But most of the time, humpback whales do not weigh this much. The Octopus Lady talked about how humpback whales go on these long migrations, and during the time that they're migrating, they tend to not be eating as regularly as they could be while they're in the feeding ground. Because of that, they're relying almost entirely on their fat stores, which means they can lose up to a third of their overall body weight. Females generally go through weight fluctuations that are even larger than males do, and that's just because females tend to be bigger, but also because females are taking care of the calves and nursing those calves, which means she's relying on her fat stores a lot more than males are. When these calves are first born, they can be about 12 feet in length and weigh about 2,000 pounds, which is the same length and weight as the humpback whale's arm. In order for adults to maintain their body weight, they have to be eating consistently while they're in the feeding grounds. During the time they're in the feeding grounds, they're eating about 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of food every single day. Humpback whales feed on a variety of small schooling fish, things like sandlance, herring, and mackerel. They'll also feed on krill, which is a crustacean kind of related to shrimp. And the way that these whales feed is actually really incredible. It's very different than the way that other whales feed, things like dolphins or killer whales. And that's because humpback whales have something called baleen in their mouth. You can see it in this picture here, but if you want a closer look, this is a humpback whale model that I have, and inside of its mouth you can see the baleen. It sits at the top jaw of the whale's mouth. They don't have anything on their bottom jaw, just their top jaw, and it basically creates a filter in the whale's mouth. Baleen is made out of keratin, which is what your fingernails and your hair is made out of. So if you want to think about what baleen might look like or feel like in real life, imagine hundreds of fingernails that are several feet long hanging from the top jaw of a whale's mouth. It's kind of a gross way to think about baleen, but it is surprisingly accurate. And the way that this works is sort of like a filter or a strainer in the whale's mouth. The whales will swim through schools of fish and pull the fish and the water into their mouth, and then they'll close their jaws super tightly and push all the water out. The water will go right through their baleen, but the fish stay trapped inside the whale's mouth, kind of like a filter. And then they're able to swallow all of that fish without swallowing the water with it. You may be thinking of the movie Finding Nemo with that big giant whale that swallowed up Marlin and Dory. And that's a blue whale, another type of baleen whale, and that's seen as a really great way to think about how the baleen whales are feeding. But the only issue I have with that scene is it's not entirely accurate. There's actually no way for fish to escape through the blowhole of a whale because the blowhole is not connected to the whale's mouth. That's a whole topic for another day, but basically, fish cannot escape the whale's mouth through the blowhole. Every now and then we do find that fish are escaping the big giant whales, and sometimes they'll jump out of the whale's mouth when their mouths are open, kind of like in this picture here, or they will just jump from the water while the whale is actively consuming or pulling all the fish into its mouth. So there are ways that fish can get away, but usually when whales are feeding, they're attracting lots of other animals to the area. So things like birds, like in this picture, or dolphins or seals, which means that any fish that are lucky enough to escape the giant whale are very likely not long for this world. Something else is going to get them. Going back to how whales feed, there's a bunch of different strategies they use to corral all the fish into one area so they can consume large amounts of prey in one go. The Octopus Lady talked before about how whales in the breeding grounds will sometimes utilize bubbles for different activities. Whales in the feeding ground will also do this. They're using bubbles to feed. Whales will actually swim in circles below the surface, blowing bubbles out of their blowhole, and that basically creates artificial nets or traps for these fish. And when faced with bubbles, fish don't really know what to do, and the only thing they really know to do to protect themselves is to school tightly together into bait balls, or tight schools of fish. And that makes it really, really easy for humpback whales to consume large amounts of prey in one bite. Humpback whales will do something called bubble netting and blowing bubble clouds. These are different ways that whales are utilizing bubbles to corral the fish tightly together to make it easy for them to eat the fish. And bubble net feeding and bubble cloud feeding is actually a really, really incredible behavior because it's a sign of intelligence in these whales. The use of bubbles in feeding and foraging is actually a sign of tool use in whales. And tool use is actually one of the ways that we can measure intelligence in animals. A recent study actually came out looking really closely at this bubble net feeding, and they found that humpback whales are controlling all sorts of elements around these bubble nets, like the number of rings that are blown and the distance between bubbles. And the idea being is that they're controlling the behavior to make sure that they're feeding in the most effective way, which again, an incredible sign of intelligence in these whales. In the Gulf of Maine, which is the area I do my research on, humpback whales do something called subsurface feeding. They'll feed on fish that hide themselves in the sandy bottom of the ocean. And in order to feed on those fish that are hiding in the sand, they have to scare the fish up into the water column. In order to do that, they actually use the side of their head and their jaws. So humpback whales have these nice big giant heads, and what they'll do is they'll actually go below the surface and use the side of their jaw and their head to scrape in the sand, and that scares the fish up into the water column. It's a really cool behavior, mainly because it gives scientists a lot of information on something called lateralization. Lateralization is a big fancy sciencey word, so let's break it down. All it means is that these whales have a preference or a dominance for a certain side of their body. So if you think about yourself, you likely have a preference for either using your right hand or using your left hand. Me personally, I'm left-handed. It's like my only personality trait other than whales. Humpback whales also have lateralization or dominance for a certain side of their body, and we can figure this out using the subsurface feeding behavior they do, because humpback whales actually prefer using one side of their head or their jaw to scrape in the sand over the other. And when they're scraping the sand, it actually leaves scarring on the side of their head and jaws. So in these pictures here, you can see one whale has scarring on the right side of its jaw, the other has scarring on the left side of its jaw, which means that one whale is right side dominant and the other is actually left side dominant. And in a study that was done here in the Gulf of Maine, we actually found that in our humpback whale population, 90% of our whales are right side dominant and only 10% are left side dominant, which means that being left-handed or left side dominant is a very exclusive club, even in whales. There's another feeding behavior that is employed by whales here in the Gulf of Maine, and it's called kick feeding. Kick feeding is basically a play on bubble feeding, so it utilizes different elements of bubble feeding with some more elements added to the behavior. Kick feeding was actually invented by a whale in the 1980s here in the Gulf of Maine, and over time it spread to the rest of the population. So this is a process called cultural transmission, where whales are learning from each other. And this is, again, one of the signs of intelligence in whales, is that they're able to invent behaviors and to use tools and to teach each other different behaviors and different ways to utilize tools. The way that kick feeding works is the whales will basically do a handstand and slap their tail at the surface of the water, and that scares fish below the surface, and then they'll go down below the surface and blow a bubble cloud or a bubble net and then start feeding on the fish. It's a really cool behavior to see, and pretty much the only place you can see it is in the Gulf of Maine because our whales invented it. One question that scientists have nowadays is how humpback whales are actually finding their food. Humpback whales cannot echolocate the way that dolphins and killer whales can, so they have to be using some other strategy to actually find where the prey is. Humpback whales have really large eyes. Their eyes are about the size of softballs. But right now, researchers are trying to investigate whether humpback whales can actually see details using those eyes. There is a theory that they don't have very good visual acuity at all. And in the areas where these whales are feeding, the water visibility tends to be very, very low, which would make it difficult for whales to see to begin with. There is actually a theory that humpback whales are finding food using modified hair cells. Humpback whales have these bumps on their heads and their jaws called tubercles. You can see it right here in this photo. And inside these bumps, they actually have modified hair cells. So again, whales are mammals. Having hair is a trait of mammals. And these modified hairs are actually acting sort of like whiskers, so they detect vibrations in the water. Humpback whales also have ears. They are internal, so you can't see them on the outside, and scientists do think that they're using hearing to pinpoint exactly where their food is. Speaking of hearing, humpback whales have a bunch of different ways that they can communicate with each other. Humpback whales are pretty famous for singing songs, which is a form of cultural transmission. Humpback whales are not born with the innate ability to sing those songs. They actually have to learn them over time. But songs and vocalizations are not the only way that these whales can communicate with each other. They actually have a bunch of behavioral displays of communication as well. Humpback whales are really famous for their acrobatic and splashy behaviors. So they do things like breaching and head breaching and tail breaching and flipper slapping and lobtailing. These are all super cool behaviors you can see from humpback whales, but they don't tend to happen all that often. These behaviors are very energetically demanding, and it's sort of like going to the gym. I'm going to expose myself here and say I don't spend 24/7 at the gym. It's the worst thing I could possibly do. These whales are not going to be spending all of their time jumping around and being very splashy. It takes a lot of energy for them to do that. But there are a lot of theories for why these behaviors do happen. One of the common theories is that it's communication. So these are behavioral displays for whales to communicate with each other. When whales are doing these behaviors, it's actually creating a lot of noise. So when they're breaching, they're throwing their entire 50-foot body out of the water. And that's going to create a really, really loud sound when they hit the surface of the water again. If they're doing something like a tail breach, like in this photo, that tail is about 12 to 15 feet wide, it's going to create a loud sound. For flipper slapping, when they take their massive pectoral fins out of the water and slap them on the surface, those arms are about 15 feet long, about 2,000 pounds. It's going to create a loud noise. Sound can actually travel faster underwater than it can through air, so it creates a really effective way for these whales to communicate with each other over long distances. We do also notice that when the wind increases, whales tend to get splashier. So there is some research that suggests that if the whales are trying to communicate and the ambient or background noise increases from the wind, they have to be louder than the wind, so they start getting splashier because of that. There's also some research that happened in the breeding grounds that suggested that certain splashy behaviors from humpback whales are really important for behavioral and social shifts, which further suggests these might be communicative behaviors. But there are lots of other theories for why whales do this splashy behavior. One of them is that it's to maintain their bodies. So we think they might be using the impact of their body hitting the surface to knock off things like dead skin and parasites. They might also be doing it to build and maintain their muscles. So the same way that we have to go to the gym to maintain our muscles, these whales might be having to build and maintain their muscles using these acrobatic behaviors. Again, whales have to use muscles for all sorts of things, like those very long migrations and protecting themselves from predators and competing with males in the breeding grounds. We find that calves that are first born tend to be very, very splashy, and we think that they're actually building their muscle to prepare for their migration to the feeding ground with their mothers when they're only a couple of months old. These behaviors may even be the whales expressing frustration or annoyance or distress or just having fun and having a good time and playing around. One of the challenges we face in studying animal behavior is that we cannot assume behaviors we see in animals are equivalent to behaviors we see in humans. All species are going to exhibit behaviors and culture and emotions and learning differently, which means that we may jump for joy when we get happy and excited, but whales could be jumping for a number of different reasons. There are so many incredible things about humpback whales, like how they can redirect blood flow to conserve oxygen while going on dives, and how they sleep with half their brain on, just like I do because I'm a grad student, and how their social systems are incredibly dynamic and complex and are constantly changing. But unfortunately, for the sake of time, we do not have the ability to talk about those things in this video. But I did make TikTok videos all about them, and I make TikTok videos about a ton of other topics, so feel free to head to my channel if you want to learn more about whales. Thank you to the octopus lady for inviting me to do my favorite thing in the entire world, which is yap about humpback whales. I'm going to pass things back to her now.
Thanks, Eman. She's great, isn't she? Everyone, go check her out on TikTok and Instagram. She deserves way more followers than she has. Anyway, making this whole video has been such a surprise. Every single thing I learned about humpback whales caught me off guard because while I liked whales more than other marine mammals, I still kinda assumed they were boring. There was no way they were more interesting than dinoflagellates, which regularly make the oceans glow bright blue, or magnapinna squid, which look like this, or sacoglossan slugs who can decapitate themselves and then just walk around as a head. And I'm not exaggerating there. Go watch my video about sacoglossan slugs. And while there's nothing cooler than self-decapitating sea slugs, that's probably one of the coolest things I've ever made a video about, humpback whales are nothing to snub your nose at. Their mysterious navigation skills, their tool usage, the fact that the males might cut each other using the barnacles on their skin like they're in a knife fight or something, that's really cool. And it's made me wonder, and I hate to admit this, what other cool stuff am I missing about marine mammals because of the prejudicial beliefs I have about them? So now I've added a bunch of marine mammals to my list of video topics. Cause like, what's going on with this guy? Why does he have a horn sticking out of his head? He's not a unicorn. Is he? And have you seen elephant seals fight? They get into it. Did you see that? Bro got thrown down like a sack of potatoes. Sorry, I didn't mean to swear. And even my sworn enemies, orcas, are on the list now because... we all remember when they were attacking yachts, and that was pretty cool. This whole experience has kind of got me re-examining my interest in mammals in general, even humans. So I was genuinely surprised by how much I enjoyed the video series Becoming Human, which is all about the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens, over on my streaming platform, Nebula. Nebula is a prestige streaming service owned and operated by all your favorite creators, like Nile Red, Minute Physics, and me, where we get to make thoughtful, high-quality videos, and you don't have to worry about ads or clickbait. This includes our Nebula Originals, which are videos you can only watch on Nebula, like Real Science's previously mentioned series, Becoming Human, which talks about things like bipedalism, tool usage, and sweating, all of which shaped humans into the walking, talking, society-building apes that we are. And exciting news for those who want to share Nebula with others, we've recently released guest passes, which means you can give your friends and family free access to our streaming platform. They get access for a full week, no payment info is required to redeem a guest pass, and there's no restrictions on what your guests can watch. If you're not already a Nebula subscriber, you can sign up using my link, nebula.tv/theoctopuslady, and get 40% off a yearly subscription, which shakes out to about $3 a month, or you can just get a regular monthly subscription for $6 a month, or you can even get a lifetime subscription for $300, which means you pay for Nebula once, and then you have access to it forever. By joining Nebula, you're helping support me and creators like me continue to make high-quality and entertaining content for you. And with that, thanks for watching another episode of Alien Ocean, and thanks again to Eman for collabing with me on this video. I've put links to her TikTok and Instagram down in the description, so go check her out. As for me, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment by answering a question I have for y'all. What genre of music do you think humpback whales sing to females? If you couldn't tell from the lyrics I picked in my video, I get the vibe that humpback whales sing a lot of like Motown and classic R&B, probably from the 1960s to the 1990s, because there's no way they aren't singing Boys to Men. You can't woo a lady whale and not sing Boys to Men, you know what I mean? But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're actually singing the humpback whale equivalent of, I don't know, death metal. Anyway, leave a comment with your answer. And special thanks, as always, to my patrons. Being a YouTuber isn't exactly the most stable profession, but your regular support offers a little bit of stability that I take a lot of comfort in. If you'd like to join my Patreon, you can check out the link below, and depending on which tier you sign up for, you can get early access to videos or your name in the beautiful credits. And then finally, be sure to check me out over on Twitter if you want to see me be a nerd about marine biology on a more regular basis. And until next time, this is your friendly neighborhood octopus lady,
And Eman,
reminding you that you don't have to go into space to find aliens.